Today we're here to talk about consumer and producer surplus, and it's especially exciting this time of year because of the holidays approaching. So we're going to look into how different the retail buying and selling of DVDs, shirts, slippers, all those kind of things tie into our topics today. First of all, we're going to take a look and zero in on consumer surplus.
So what exactly is consumer surplus? Well, what it does is it measures the benefit that a buyer receives for participating in a market. You can find this value by looking at the amount that a buyer is willing to pay for a product and subtracting the amount that they actually pay.
It's important to note, however, that not every consumer is going to have the same consumer surplus. And basically that's because each individual consumer has a different willingness to pay. Willingness to pay measures the maximum amount that a consumer would be willing to pay for a good. So while I might be willing to pay $20 for this Goonies DVD, Steph might only be willing to pay $15. So when we go to the store and it costs $15, I see a benefit of $5, but Steph isn't going to see a benefit at all.
Okay, so as we look at the supply and the demand curves, we see that the consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve and above the asking price. As we look at the demand curve higher up, we see that people are demanding it at this higher price. But since they're only being asked to pay this lower price, everything in between the amount that they are willing to pay and what's being asked to pay is their consumer surplus.
Okay, so we've already discussed willingness to pay a little bit, but we're going to take a closer look at it now. Basically, what willingness to pay is the largest sum of money an individual is willing to pay for a product or service.
So here we have a graph of our own group's willingness to pay for a DVD in the market today. So as we move down the line, I am willing to pay $20 for a DVD, Steph $15, Carrie $10, and Crystal is only willing to pay $5 for a DVD. So now if we go to the store and the DVD is priced at $15, first of all, it's important to note that Steph and I are going to be the only ones who purchase the DVD because the price is already above what the other two members were willing to pay. And now, also, if you look at this $15, I'm the only one that's going to be seeing a benefit in this market. So I have a consumer surplus of $5 and no one else is seeing a consumer surplus.
Alright, so we look again at the willingness to pay of each individual of our group. So, as we all know, during the holiday season, there are often a lot of sales that happen at stores. So let's say that instead of asking $15 for a DVD, the store now asks for $10. So when we have that price point of $10, we see that it's no longer just Megan and I that are willing to buy the DVD, but also Carrie. So all three of us get to benefit from the good being sold. So then when we tie that into consumer surplus, we see that Megan's consumer surplus increases by $5, and so her total consumer surplus is $10, 10 to 20. But I also get to appreciate consumer surplus as I was willing to pay $15 but only had to pay $10. So my consumer surplus is $5.
Now we're going to stop and we're going to turn around and look at producer surplus. Producer surplus is very similar to how consumer surplus works, except for now we're looking at it from the side of production. So basically what we're measuring is the benefit that a seller receives for producing goods in a market. Now this can be found by looking at the amount a seller receives for a product minus the cost of producing that product.
So like we saw in consumer surplus, each individual consumer has their own willingness to pay, which is the maximum amount they're going to pay for a good. Now as you look at the producing side, each producer is going to have their own willingness to sell. Now how willingness to sell works is it's the minimum amount a producer is willing to sell their products for on the market. So our example that we've been looking at, if Steph is producing DVDs and selling them on the market, she may be willing to sell them for $10. And if we go to the store and the price of the DVD is $15, Steph is going to see a producer surplus of that $5. But myself, you know, the cool person I am, I was flown to Hollywood last night and got this big producer spectacular deal, and I'm now producing movies. So when my movies hit the market, you better believe that they're going to be $50, and I probably will not be seeing a producer surplus.
So like we already mentioned, each producer is going to have their own individual willingness to sell. And basically this willingness to sell is the minimum price that a producer is going to sell their item for on a market. Cost is an important thing to look at when we're talking about willingness to sell. Each individual producer is going to have a related cost for the production of their goods. That could be anything from materials to equipment to labor costs. So if the cost for producing a good is $10, that producer would probably not be willing to sell that product for $10 because then they wouldn't be seeing a benefit. Instead, they'd likely to be willing to sell that product for $15 or $20.
So again, we look at the supply and demand curves. As we saw with consumer surplus being below the demand curve and above the asking price, producer surplus is above the supply curve and below the asking price. So if the producer is willing to sell their DVD for, let's say, $2 and the asking price is $10, they're going to have a producer surplus of $8. Now, when we take a look at Megan, who's only willing to sell her DVDs for $50, we see that she's not going to have a producer surplus unless the asking price is raised above $50. So as we look at willingness to sell, we see that I would be willing to sell a DVD for $10. Carrie would be willing to sell it for $20, and Crystal would be willing to sell it for $30. So let's say we go to the store and we see DVDs on sale for $10. So I would be the only one who would be selling my DVDs there. But if we were to charge $20 in stores, both Carrie and I would be willing to. However, Carrie wouldn't have any kind of producer surplus because she would just be breaking even. But I would have the $10 producer surplus that would result from a sale of $20 when my asking price was $10.
So as Steph mentioned, we saw that when the price increases, more people are going to be involved in the producer surplus. And this is obviously really important for me because I'm only willing to sell way up here for $50, so I need the price to continue to increase in order for me to see a producer surplus. Now this is different from consumer surplus, which we saw, because in order for the consumer surplus to increase and reach new consumers, we actually needed the price to be lowering.
So we've talked about consumer surplus and producer surplus, and the last thing that we're going to touch on is total surplus, which simply put is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So now we look at the graphical representation of total surplus. Our consumer surplus that we saw before, everything below the demand curve and above the price point, is still shown in the graph. But we also have the producer surplus shown, everything above the supply curve and below the price point. And when you add those two together, you get your total surplus.
So the last thing we're going to touch on today is one last final breakdown of what exactly is total surplus. So we already talked about how total surplus is going to be your consumer surplus plus your producer surplus. So if you break this down and you look at it individually, we know that our consumer surplus is the value to the buyer, which is their willingness to pay, subtract the amount that they paid. And also our producer surplus is what they receive minus the cost of that item. So if we looked at these together, we know that this amount received is equal to the amount paid. And so then we look, the value minus the cost is going to be put back into the total surplus equals consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So it seems confusing, but it works down to the fact that total surplus is going to be what the value to the buyers is minus what the cost to the sellers is. So that said, we know that the things with the highest value to buyers and the lowest cost to sellers are going to be those with the most surplus and thus the most benefit to our society as a whole.